What we've got structured today is I'm going to do just a quick run through on a slide presentation that is available to look at, and then I'll throw to the panel with questions, and hopefully we'll get some nice insightful questions from all of you audience members, because the one thing I do know is that everybody has got an opinion about asset consultants. So I'd like to introduce our speakers. We've got Fiona Trafford-Walker, Director of Consulting from Frontier Advisors, Martin Goss, Director of Investments, Australia, Willis Towers Watson, Hendrie Koster, Director of Strategic Research, Mercer, and Duncan Smith, Head of Consulting, JANA. So welcome, panellists. The key themes, so the panellists got together and did a presentation, and the key themes that came out of the presentations was that firstly, reports of the death of asset consulting are greatly exaggerated. And as you can see, they're here, they're alive, they're not dead. The interesting statistics that our panellists came up with is that the super industry represents about $720 billion worth of funds under advisement or management, and there's 94 funds in that universe. That excludes self-managed super funds. The other lines of business are non-super, so advising sovereign wealth funds, endowment, charities, and that tends to be a lot more granular with a lot more clients. Frontier and JANA, funds under advice, about 90% of it covers the superannuation space, whereas Mercer and Willis Towers Watson, it's a roughly 50-50. I've taken some liberties with statistics, but it gives you an idea of where their business is coming from. The challenges that the panellists have identified for we the funds are policy, regulation, competition and retailisation, if that's a word, investment risk, and finally ESG. So throwing across to the panellists, and starting with you, Fiona, because of course I've got to declare the interest that First Super is a shareholder, and you're advise us as well. And one of the things that we've noticed in our relationship is the turnover of talent. And it must be a pretty big issue for all four panellists here, nurturing talent and retaining talent. And I think it tends to be a bit cyclical. So, Fiona?
Yep, sure. Thank you, Bill. And thanks everyone for staying. I know it's pretty hard to be the last session of a conference, but hopefully it'll be interesting for you. So the staff turnover is something that clearly has been quite an issue for many consulting firms, and in many ways it's flattering to know that your clients and other funds think your staff are so good that they'd like them to work in their organisations, but it does create some challenges, and of the last 8 people we've lost, for example, 6 have gone to super funds. Not all our clients, but 6 out of 8 have gone to super funds, and that's a big difference to maybe 5-10 years ago when we did lose people, they would tend to go to fund managers or other places. But in the end, my view is that people work where they want to work. You've got one life, you should do with that life what you want to do, that you think is valuable, interesting. And all that we do as a firm is just create opportunities for smart people to work with other smart people, to do good work, rewarding work, and just respect people's decisions when they choose to move. But it does create issues for clients because consulting is very much relationship driven, and so you need to manage the relationships with clients. And certainly in First case, there's been turnover there, and by having a larger, diverse firm, you can put in other people, but it can certainly be destabilising, and I think it's something that we need to sort of think about. How do we retain people? How do we attract people? And we've got to be innovative about that.
Yeah. So Hendrie, you come from a much larger firm, and I think earlier on when we were talking about it, you talked about Boomerangs in terms of your staff.
It's a common sort of anomaly, if you like, in terms of the Mercer culture. I think we really try and foster innovative and challenging environment for all our staff, and so we have what we call Boomerangs, Mercer Boomerangs. Quite often we've got staff that come back for a second or third bite at the cherry with Mercer. They go through different stages of their career. They might have joined as an analyst, went off and did something at a fund management firm, came back, did something else again. So most of you will know Russell Clark, for instance. He's on his 3rd stint with Mercer. We've got many Boomerangs, as you call it. Sometimes they're gone for years, sometimes they come back pretty quickly. And as Fiona suggested there, that nowadays our staff members go more to super funds, whereas in the past maybe it was more investment banks and fund managers, but they then come back with a different knowledge base again, and perhaps it's more at that sort of senior level where we'll be seeing that in the future. But it's an ecosystem, and we welcome those members back. So all we can do is create a innovative culture and make it interesting for those staff so they know what they leave behind when they go away, and in many cases we take people back as well.
And your experience, Martin?
So I think we're actually, we've always had turnover. We've probably noticed it more actually in the more junior levels historically, where people start as grads that's kind of up to, say, 5 years experience and then looking for something else. And they were going to fund managers, now they go to funds. We've been losing people at the more senior level right now, but I actually think we're just at the start of a cycle where people are going into funds for some part of their career and then will be coming back to consulting. And I think the linkages between working in funds and consulting are, the overlaps are actually very strong, and the benefits of what each can learn from the other and those aspects of those careers moving between them is actually more valuable for the whole system. And so what we're expecting, and certainly our last couple of hires have both come from funds, is this aspect that there's a career step when you're in a fund where it may take a while to get the experience to get to some of the next levels. You will probably get that more quickly potentially in consulting and different perspectives, and then you can feed back into the system. So we actually, longer term, it actually could be healthy. It just has been, I'd say, a difficult probably 3 years when you look at the whole consulting industry of that kind of adjustment period. But then also when I look at it and say, so has it been that we haven't been able to find people to fill the spots? The answer is no.
So Duncan, I think I now remember, of course, you were on the other side, or JANA, my old shop where I worked at Statewide, you picked up Jimmy Vernon Payne, which I think was a loss to Statewide, and I think, so, how does it feel when you recruit from funds?
Yeah, so we have had quite a bit of success over the journey of recruiting from our own clients, but what we've actually found is most of those opportunities have come from open dialogues with the client. So the client said, look, I'll pick on Jimmy, he's not here, but that was a situation where he was looking for to develop his career, and the client was quite open with us.
To put it bluntly, he'd had enough of working with Con, hadn't he?
I'm not going to go down there. But that was an open conversation, and so it was actually a win-win for the client, because this is someone that was at a stage of his career. He wanted to experience, a different city and a different experience, and it's been a fantastic. And that's just one example where it's actually been a win-win. So hopefully over time we will have a bit more of that free movement. We're just looking for a little bit of a back at some stage. Can we please?
So turning to another area, relationships. Tends to be, I think, from my perspective as a fund CEO, and from a small fund, I tend to look at things rather one-dimensionally with our asset consultants. But it strikes me that asset consultants as trusted advisors have got a multi-layered, multilateral relationship with their clients. And with any fund or owner of capital, there's actually, in fact, multiple clients within that, multiple conversations to be had. You've got the investment committee, members of the investment committee, the chair of the investment committee, the chair, the CEO, CIO, and everybody else. So starting with you, Duncan, how do you actually manage that relationship? It must be pretty complex.
It can be, and this is something that I think has got more acute in recent years as the internal teams have got larger and larger. So, look, as a generalisation, we report to the board and to the trustee. But on a day-to-day basis, we spend nearly all of our time talking to internal teams. So balancing how you play different roles is sometimes difficult, it's challenging, but it can also be very rewarding as well. But you do play very different roles within the one client base. So the board wants governance, the investment committee wants strategy, the CIO wants a deeper level of strategy, understanding different asset classes. The sector specialist wants very detailed, asset-specific information. And so I think the way we're thinking about developing that model is to basically have more specialisation, which I think we've all built up over a period of time. But you still need that generalist for the board who can cover a range of different issues. So it is difficult, but it is manageable. And the key thing is accountability, understanding who plays what role within that client base.
So Martin, how do you cope with it? I mean, it strikes me that you have situations where the investment team wants an outcome, or might want a recommendation for a manager, whatever. and you're the trusted independent advisor, and as Duncan's saying, responsibilities to the board, not to the investment team. How do you navigate through? Because ultimately, you could end up being CIO could chuck a tantrum, and they're very good at it, and you could end up getting fired for doing the right thing.
So I think there's two parts to it. One is that it's multi-layered. So what will often happen is some of the deeper, more detailed conversations can be held with specialists on a one-to-one. And then you have the generalist sort of consultant who may well critique both the internal team's view as well as what their team is saying. So they're actually standing to a degree aside and saying, well, look, this is what's going to matter to the board, and acting as a kind of an oversight on that. At meetings, you would always prefer to have the right to say, we have a different view. Now, there will be some cases where CIOs really try and advocate for that not to happen. Now, I'm not convinced that's good governance, but that happens. In that case, what you will be doing is there will be potentially discussions outside with the CEO or chair, because you can't be muzzled. Going back to Duncan's point, unless you have been specifically hired by the investment team for the investment team only, your responsibility is to the board.
Yep.
So you've got to work out what channels you need to use when to give your advice kind of effectively full and free.
Yeah.
That model's evolving quickly. We're seeing new structures coming in place in terms of that governance. So in terms of having an advisor to the board and the committee and to the internal team, sometimes they come from the same firm. So Mercer or any one of us could advise the internal team and the board, but quite often now we invited to do one role or the other. So most of us here advise boards directly as an advisor to the committee or the board, whereas our firms don't necessarily do the investment advice for the team. That's provided by one of the other firms. So that helps manage that conflict in terms of being aligned too closely with the internal team or otherwise, and it sort of keeps it a bit more independent.
Yeah. So Fiona, one of the things that in our discussions this morning that I hadn't really thought about was that for our Audit and Compliance Committee, the internal auditors who are outsourced and the external auditors, obviously outsourced, get quality time with the Audit and Compliance Committee by themselves without management present to make sure that they've got a clear line of sight. Now, I've never experienced that with asset consultants, the trusted advisors and the investment committee or the board. Is that something that you've experienced or you think there's value in?
It's not that common in my experience, but I think there are moments when you would like to have the ear of just the board. But I think once it gets to that level, it's really, you've escalated it quite a lot. Unless it's a routine part of your agenda, it means you are escalating something to a board. And I think at that point, the relationship's clearly gone wrong a long time ago. So it's really, as Martin was saying, it's about the relationships you have outside the board to make sure that you're all on the same page. In the end, you're all there for the one thing, which is to get the best outcome for the end user, which is the members or a beneficiary or a sponsor. And so if you feel you need to raise something, then I would start off being discreet about it with the CEO or the chair and work that way. But I think it's good practice. I think when you look at the listed company environment and you have a risk and audit committee, there's typically always a session at the beginning or the end just with the auditor. Mostly not much gets said in my very limited experience, but it's the opportunity to raise something if it needs to be raised.
Yeah.
So I think it's good practice, but ideally that's not the last resort.
Yeah.
I just want to make one brief comment just on the earlier point. The best relationships, I think, are where you acknowledge that it's not actually a competition. You're not there competing with the internal team. You're there working with them. You get by far the best results when it's collaborative and you work together and your work isn't vetted or filtered or restrained or whatever. And in the end, I think it's a strong CIO that sits there and says, you know what, I thought that, but you've convinced me I'm going to change my mind, and we have the same. I mean, investments, as you know, there's usually not one right answer. So that no competition and the strong collaboration, I think that's what gets very good outcomes. And that would mean that you shouldn't have to resort to having, private time with the board and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So if I can start on the private time, one of the things when you do that, you can have one session which is just this private time, everyone turns up, what are we going to talk about? That can be very stilted. I think the idea of a discussion probably with a chair or someone beforehand to say, well, look, what might we discuss? And it's just a really short agenda, so that you've then got some focus. It doesn't have to be more than a 15-minute conversation, but then you know where you're going to go rather than how do we fill this time is a useful thing to do.
Yep. So Duncan, 2008, pre-GFC, 2016, Lots happened in the investment industry, I suppose, in that 8-year period. So are asset consulting firms the same as they were 8 years ago?
No, they're not the same as they were 8 years ago, and they won't be the same in another 8 years. I think we're pretty sure about that. So it is quite interesting how asset consulting has evolved. Our personal experience is, as I said before, the need for specialisation has certainly increased quite substantially. That will only increase going forward. There's no doubt about that. The interesting thing is that as our larger clients evolve and adapt and really think about investing in a different way, we need to evolve and adapt with them. But there is still a large number of our clients which are smaller in nature that still will need that generalist asset consulting role. So the idea that we will look and feel a lot different in the future, absolutely, especially in regards to the way that we interact with our clients through technology, through the way that we interact, and the fact that everything will eventually be so much more easily accessed. It won't be picking up the phone call and saying, "Hey, Duncan, can you do X, Y, Z?" It'll be very different from that perspective. And the other issue that we face today is that it is not a scalable business as you would think. Unfortunately, there are so many nuanced investments out there, and as time's gone on and we see no value in bonds, and we're trying to get more diversification in the portfolios, and we're trying to get things that are less correlated to equities, we're finding that we're actually looking at more and more one-off investments that really are only applicable for a client. They might be capacity constrained. So once again, what does that do? It actually increases the workload, it increases the specialisation. And so that really is changing the way that we're thinking about not only what we do, but also how we deliver it.
So your perspective, Fiona?
I don't think that sort of our firms could be sort of more different to what they all were 8 years ago. I mean, it used to be you had your two globals and your two locals, and you did manager research, investment policy, sort of standard stuff. Whereas when I look at the list on the screen there, you can see we are all evolving in the way that we individually think is best for this market, for the people that we have, for the people we can attract, for the clients that we have, trying to stay ahead of clients but also work with them to remain valuable and useful. Because in the end, the definition of what a good consultant is really hard. I mean, you can't just pick a number and say we added this value and that was all us, because it's just never that easy. A lot of it is very subjective. And I think that now from a customer point of view or a client point of view, there's quite a lot of pretty good choice. And I think, some good firms, strong firms, and there are some niche specialised firms as well. So from an industry perspective, I think it's evolving, reasonably well. But that's not to say, as Duncan says, there are definitely challenges. So I think it's much tougher to be a consultant today, but it's tougher to be a CIO today. It's tougher to be a trustee today. I think tougher to be a member today. So, I think generally the bar is higher for everything, but I think that Duncan's quite right.
Yeah. So from a larger firm, Martin had...
So I mean, effectively, the way we're thinking is, where possible, we want to think as a portfolio manager would, and then work out how do we help various clients do things. So, for instance, one aspect of it might be that we're responsible for a lot. In other cases, we're just an extension of a team. But we've got to have that thinking of how should the team be doing it, and that knowledge, and then what part of our knowledge base do they need. So effectively, we can be effectively anything from a trusted advisor to a consultant telling people what to do, to actually someone who's implementing. And that aspect, as Duncan said, of the massive variety of those relationships, depending on where funds are at, is how we've had to evolve. Yeah. So effectively, the thinking is often the same at its core, but how you pass that and help people in various areas depending on their resourcing and what they need is what we have to kind of adapt with and have been adapting with.
Well, clients are also evolving. They're engaging with us all in different ways. In terms of Mercer's revenue base, we've done a proactive exercise in terms of diversifying our business, and so whilst only about 50% comes from the super industry at the moment, we have a pretty large exposure now to wealth management and to insurance and endowments and foundations as well. So that specialist model had to be implemented internally as well to get consultants focusing on those areas. But clients increasingly engage all of us for the pockets of excellence that they see us adding value in. Some clients might engage us in the old model, if you like, so one consultant for everything on a large retainer. Others will engage us on a project basis for whatever the areas where they feel Mercer, Frontier, JANA or Towers Watson can provide an input. And on that basis, it's really changed our business model to a large extent. In terms of project work, we do a substantial amount of project-based work nowadays, and we budget for project-based work as opposed to just retainer work. I'd say in the last 2-3 years, it's come in at about 20% of all our revenue per annum is on standalone project-based work that we didn't know what those projects were going to be at the start of the year.
So if you've got a question, please use the Ask a Question function on the app. So a question from the audience, and I'll start with you, Fiona, because I think this is an area that both you and I have had some involvement in recently, is should investment consultants collaborate as a collective to help shape the policy side of our industry?
Oh, absolutely. It was always kind of strange to me that we'd have these firms that, you know, you sort of knew each other and everyone would say, oh, do you know so-and-so at time? Oh, sort of, not really. And the last, I think, 5 or 6 years, I think we've all made a much better effort to, you know, get to know each other better, to do some things together. We did a big project with the regulator on the return target and the dashboard. You know, we didn't win that, sorry, but, you know, we tried. That was the first time that I think the 4 major firms got together and thought, this is actually an industry issue. We've gotten together in a working group to work with AIST on operational due diligence. So, and the policy stuff is just the next level. And I think in the consulting firms, I think the funds have access to a lot of, you know, smart people on the same page as you, trying to get the same outcomes as you, and there are definitely resources that can be used to work jointly on things. It's a resource constraint issue, I guess, as Duncan said. You're looking at managers and strategies and things, and the policy side is significant, but I'm sure these guys are the same. When we get asked to help on things, we're really happy to help and, you know, lend our expertise, whether it's technical expertise or whether it's just lend our name or time, people, thoughts, whatever, but I think we could definitely do more.
The one issue you do face, though, is that if you're out there representing your client base, you have to be conscious that the fact that you don't want to represent a position that you're almost representing a client that a client doesn't agree with. So it is a bit of a balancing act. So when you have issues which are basically agreed across your client base, I think that's when you can take the strongest stance and have the biggest impact.
Often many consulting individuals participate in other industry bodies, whether that's the Actuaries Institute or CFA Society or otherwise, and in that format it's a bit easier to actually lobby and implement for changes without necessarily representing a client in that framework.
So a question for all of you. As a consumer of services, often us clients are pretty difficult.
No,
Never.
not you, Bill.
Thanks, Fiona. Clients have got a need, and they come to you and say, look, we want this done. But, you know, you're on the consulting side and you know more about what the client actually wants, and, you know, that situation of having to do a reverse brief to ensure that the client actually gets fulfilment. So throwing it open to each of you and starting with Fiona, you know, to get a really good relationship out of the client, and we talk about just say a specific project, what do you actually want from us?
Well, it takes time. I mean, you know, any consultant in your relationship is a relationship. You know, you need to respect the people that you work with. You need to think they're good at their job. I think you've got to be on the same page with what you're trying to achieve. So you have to make sure you truly understand the client, and also that the client understands what you can do and, you know, where your strengths and weaknesses are, because there's some things that you would be better to go to someone else for. I think that's something that's changed quite a lot in the last little while. I think the other thing is just to be open about what we can all achieve, the time frames, the deliverables. You know, manager research is a very good example. You know, there are thousands and thousands of managers out there. You don't need to look at every single one to find the best 3 or 5 that make sense for the client. So thinking about how you use your resources to respond to a client challenge. But the main thing for me is just make sure that you understand your client. It's like the know your client, you know, rules, just to make sure that you're on the same page and you can get the outcome that they want. And an open relationship, so you can say, look, I don't think you need to do it that way. Here's another way to think about it.
Yeah. Martin?
Yeah. Well, I think that comment of the quality of the relationship and avoiding the kind of servant master or that sort of mentality, so that you're willing to say, well, why are we talking about this? have you thought about this? That challenge back, rather than just saying, well, you've asked me to do this, okay, I'm going to do it. I think that's really important. There will be some relationships where you just get a tiny piece and that's all you can do. But the better relationships are the ones where you can push back and ask why, because that's what really consulting is about. What are you trying to achieve, and how can we help you achieve that?
Hendrie?
No, I'd agree with that. I think this idea of being an extension to an internal team, that's something where we all had to evolve how we work, because it's no longer a case of doing trustee packs once a quarter and that's the only time you sort of have interaction in that run-up to that period. Now it's ongoing daily conversations, sometimes with multiple team members, and you need to figure out who the best contact people are across that daily interaction. But that just leads to better expectations. And I think that the thing that's a little bit challenging is over time you work out what works for everyone in the best interest of the members at the end of the day. But from time to time you get changes at the client side as well. And so a new CIO will come in, and the new CIO will need to sort of show that he or she is adding value and putting their own stamp on things. And that's when the consultant needs to adapt, get used to what the new person wants, while still sort of being cognizant of the good work that might have been done in the past.
Yeah. Duncan?
I think it's just about building trust. If you have trust in each other, it gives you the capacity to openly say, well, look, I just don't agree with that. Investments is all about grey. It's shades of grey. There's very rarely a right and wrong. And a good working relationship is when you can say, well, look, I'm not overly comfortable of this decision because of X, Y, and Z, and it's an open question, rather than saying, oh, geez, I don't really want to raise that because it might have poor implications down the road. You just can't get into that situation. And at some stage, you will be wrong. That is investments. And so, but the fact that you've gone through a process, you've tried to do the right thing, means that they'll have confidence in you that is a rarity, and that over time, you'll make more decisions that are right, that you'll add performance over time, and you're generally supportive of the internal team, because the internal team are an incredible part of the success or failure of a super fund. So you have to work effectively with them, and there's a lot of incredibly smart people within these super funds, and so you get a lot of ideas off internal teams that you actually help with your own education and your own development as well. Doesn't mean we always have to agree, but if you can disagree in a respectful manner, it's just about building better outcomes.
Yep.
So,
a question from the audience. Is there a place for asset consultants to work with fund managers in product development? How would you feel about that?
I'll answer that one. This is something. So, on our advisory business, we just have a blanket rule: we don't work for investment managers, because you start to say yes, you can, or you can't. We just thought it was easier just to say no. So.
Maybe a slight variation of that is not necessarily working with the manager to develop the product, because then sits the conflict that, well, if you helped us build it, surely you should now rate it highly because you were involved, that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
But the flip side of it is often you work with managers to develop the product that you need for your clients, and if that product doesn't exist, then there's a mutual beneficial arrangement there by working with managers to build that product, which then gets used for your clients. So purpose-built solution.
I agree with that. If you've got a product which is basically you want to have exposure to, but it's got a couple of elements that doesn't work, trying to get those elements right is certainly in scope.
So that's basically saying you shouldn't just be an advisory role to fund managers. They want something, you do it.
Yep.
But your ability to go and say, this needs to be here in the market, working with a manager to create what you want, absolutely better outcome for clients.
Yep. Fiona?
We're very happy to give feedback in terms of saying that's just not going to fly, the structure's wrong, the alignment's wrong, the fees are wrong, whatever, if a manager comes and asks, because in the end we want to be able to take good products and good ideas to our clients. So and from that point of view, I think it's helpful to have the feedback early, but we would never sit and say, and if you do these things, then you'll get money. That's just not our role to be able to say that. But we're really happy to provide feedback on what we think a good structure looks like, and I think increasingly things like alignment of interest, just making sure people are on the same page could be valuable.
It's the remuneration element, which I think...
Yeah, we don't want to be paid for that,
Which is the issue.
So in terms of managers, one of the things that I've noticed in the last 12, 24 months is I've had lots of managers come to me to talk about partnering and value adding. And, if a manager comes to me and offers me something for nothing, initial instinct is this ain't right, something can go horribly wrong. So we've been offered things like access to risk modelling tools, factor analysis, and it strikes me that creates a risk for a fund if they head down that path, because it's a very porous boundary that you then have. And managers don't do nothing for nothing, and I think that's to create a relationship where potentially it's pretty hard to give them the flick. Hendrie, I think you've got some observations on that.
No, I think that's right, but I think that's a deliberate model by many service providers is to establish a longer term working relationship, and I don't think that's going to change. We see that more and more. Internal teams in particular are quite demanding of their managers nowadays and of their consultants. The observation that I had earlier is that from our perspective, we're actually quite surprised that the fund management industry as a whole hasn't moved more towards consulting sooner. So we're seeing more of these solution teams being developed and that sort of style of interaction with clients as opposed to just product pushing. Consulting firms over time, some of them, including ourselves, have moved to a model where our services can be accessed in different ways. So whether it's pure consulting, investment tools only, or whether it's on the implemented side. So it's just a continuum of services accessing that IP. And so that's the counterpoint, is where consultants have moved from, certainly we have, from just a pure consulting base and that's all we do. We can do multiple things, and some of it looks a bit more like funds management. On the other hand, we'd expect fund managers to more proactively start doing that as well, so that they won't necessarily say that they're consultants, but they basically deliver consulting advice as part of their service proposition.
Yep. I think the key thing is looking at what you're paying and what you're getting. So I mean, with funds management, if you're kind of paying a large amount for one service and it's free for the other, break it down and see what you're getting. Probably with consulting, you tend to be able to see pretty transparently, this is what you're paying, this is what you're getting. Yep. So it's just being aware of what you're getting.
Yeah, I was just going to say, for our larger funds, I think in the future, what will they and won't pay for? I think they'll pay for insights, they'll pay for innovation, and they'll pay for governance. But there's a lot of stuff around that peripheral that historically it's been bundled up by us as consultants, which they won't really be prepared to pay much for. But once again, you've got other clients, whether they be smaller super funds, whether they be some of the endowments and other not-for-profits that still will need that sort of all-encompassed general
Thank you.
approach.
So I'm just conscious of the time, and I know that there's been one member of the audience who has been grossly overlooked with all of his questions. And I think it's a nice way to finish up because it picks up a number of the questions. So, Sammy.
So I was just going to say, can you tell Sam to
He's still writing one.
He's still writing another question.
Yeah, and there's only one here, mate.
Some of those others are definitely his.
If you wonder why we're distracted, I keep on laughing at some of these questions.
Okay, so we've got 2 minutes to go, so you've got about 30 seconds each. So Sam Cecilia says that asset consultants would be, as an industry, would be a survivor in a nuclear war. So I think you're calling them cockroaches. Is he correct? Will asset consultant, what will it be like in 29-25? And you've got about 25 seconds each. Fiona.
I think he's gone a fat finger slip there. I think you mean 20-25, not 29-25, Sam, because 29-25, I'll be a crusty old biddy by then. Look, I don't know. I mean, if you asked me 10 years ago, I wouldn't have known what it would be like today. I suspect we just become a lot broader advisory businesses, working with the clients through all dimensions of their business, hopefully. But in the end, if we're not adding value, we'll go and run a B&B somewhere.
Martin?
Yeah, I think probably would be more project-based in certain niches and utterly different with different clients.
Hendrie?
Yeah, specialist model, plug and play, and the users will access our IP as it fits their model, not how it fits our model.
So the final word, Mr. JANA.
I think there will be more contacts with more people with more specialist skills. So instead of having 3 people that you see every quarter, different people will be touching 10, 20 different people within each asset consultant, and they'll be doing it online and they'll be doing it on a daily basis.